Everybody was a loser, but the biggest loser was the United States of America and the millions of people who tuned in and are represented by this current president.
My name is Mark Hanna, and I'm your host for None of the Above, a podcast of the Eurasia Group Foundation. Today, I'm joined by Doug Wilson, who has a 40-year career in foreign policy, national security, politics, and communication strategy. Doug served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs under President Obama, among other senior positions at the Pentagon. He played a key role in the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. He has 3 times been awarded the Department of Defense Distinguished Public Service Medal, the Pentagon's highest civilian honor, and most recently served as the senior foreign policy advisor to 2020 presidential candidate Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who is also a good friend and protege. We're really glad to have you with us, Doug, today. And what we're going to be talking about is, you have deep experience in national security and foreign policy in the context of presidential campaigns, and we're in the thick right now, thick of the Trump-Biden contest here. And what we saw on Tuesday night was basically a disaster of a debate. We were preparing to ask you some questions about national security and foreign policy, probing the veracity and the relevance of the candidate questions and their performance on substance, but we really didn't see a lot of substance. So I just want to ask you, Doug, let's just jump right in. What was your initial reaction to Tuesday night's debate?
By this time, virtually every adjective in the book describing this as a total disaster has been used.
That was a hot mess inside a dumpster fire, inside a train wreck. That was the worst debate I have ever seen. In fact, it wasn't even a debate. It was a disgrace.
The question Supreme is, Court Justice,
the
radical
question,
left.
Would you shut up, man?
Listen, who is on your list, Joe? Who's on your list?
Right, gentlemen, I think
this is so unprecedented. He's going to pack the court.
We have
not going to give a list.
We have ended this segment. We're going to move on to the second segment.
That was really a productive segment, wasn't it?
The CNN team, which called it a shit show, and I realize I've now used up my quota of profanity here, but it totally deserved that. Everybody was a loser, but the biggest loser was the United States of America and the millions of people who tuned in and are represented by this current president. I kept thinking what it must be like to be a parent and have your kids watch this television program. I kept thinking if you were in Moscow or Beijing or Tehran, what joy you must be getting out of watching this disintegration of civility, intelligence, and discourse. I kept thinking if you were in countries where we have had strong alliances and partnerships, what a huge disappointment this was for those who hoped that ultimately the United States was going through a temporary phase. Most of all, I thought about the Wizard of Oz, and I thought what we saw was the person behind the curtain. We call him the president because it was a legitimate election, and that's the office he holds. But he in no way, shape, or form carries himself like a leader of this country. And it was an enormous, and sad occasion to see this spectacle being broadcast throughout the world as a representation of American democracy.
At the end of the day, did Tuesday night's debate essentially reveal that America is its own worst enemy?
The Tuesday night debate revealed that we have a leadership which is bereft of any kind of sense of direction, civility, or understanding of what it takes to provide leadership in the world. Because the issue with regard to our adversaries is not only the military threats, but the direct appeal to civil societies, both in the United States and abroad, about the viability of our system, the vibrancy of our democracy, the ability to connect values and interests. I am old enough to remember solidarity in Poland and what a key role United States public diplomacy officials played with regard to that spark that ultimately led to the end of communism, because they were able to effectively communicate to civil society leaders the dichotomy between the communist system and democratic values, and succeeded over the course of years and decades in instilling and lighting that fire. We're seeing the same thing happen to us as the flip side of the coin now by adversaries in Russia and China and Iran, basically showing to the world and conveying this lack of leadership and this lack of the ability of this administration to connect interests and values. And we are seeing that play out across the board, across the spectrum around the world.
Especially now when you have English-speaking young people living in China, living in Shanghai and in Moscow. Is there a way in which basically that these debates that had to be decoded and interpreted by foreign media in the past are now getting accessed directly by these foreign publics, and without understanding, America's history of like messy campaigns, like how does this embarrassment actually translate into diminished, not just prestige, but diminished influence in the world?
You're absolutely right that the advent of social media means instantaneous communication. We all have cameras on our phones. We never had cameras or phones, in the era of solidarity. So anybody can watch any of this. This translates on everything from a renewed commitment to deal with racial inequality as a result of people being able to film atrocities as they take place. And it means that people can watch and see what's going on, not only on our streets, but within our government. I think, though, Mark, that the key to last night meant that you didn't need to have a filter to watch a man whose title is President of the United States continue to blast allies, demean individuals who hold office, demean families, convey a complete misunderstanding or lack of understanding of dealing with the worst pandemic in 100 years, and fail to explicitly disavow white supremacists as a key element of the violence that we're seeing in this country and an expression of hatred. That is a hard thing to explain away. And I think Joe Biden last night did the best he could, and it was certainly enough to continue the lead that he has, a very steady lead. This next administration, as I'm sure you know, is going to have enormous boulders to push uphill, because it's not going to be an automatic light switch in terms of both America's credibility abroad, people's perception of America and its interests and its values. And this is going to take a very long time.
I do want to get into some of the grist and some of the substance of the debate itself, because there were moments where foreign policy and national security came up, and one is when Vice President Biden really took umbrage with Donald Trump referring to soldiers and service members as suckers and losers, and he did it in a very personal way.
He's not a war hero. He's a war hero. He's a war hero.
5.5 years.
He's a war hero because he was captured. I like people that weren't captured, okay? I hate to tell you.
The Atlantic magazine reports Donald Trump told staff, "Why should I go to that cemetery? It's filled with losers." Later, he called 1,800 Americans who died in the legendary Battle of Belleau Wood suckers for getting killed.
He doesn't understand why one would go pay that level of respect to fallen American soldiers.
And the way you talk about the military, the way you talk about them being losers and being and just being suckers. My son was in Iraq. He spent a year there. He got the Bronze Star. He got the Conspicuous Service Medal. He was not a loser. He was a patriot, and the people left behind there were heroes.
Really?
And I resent.
Are you talking
like
about
hell.
Hunter? Are you talking about
I'm talking about my son, Beau Biden. You're talking about.
To what extent do you think? I think the president thinks he might have service members on his side. What do you, given your experience in the Pentagon, where do you think service members exist on the political spectrum? What are the assets and liabilities each campaign brings to trying to earn their votes?
I think it is a mistake to categorize all veterans, just like it would be to categorize any particular group, as being monolithic. Certainly my 3 times at the Pentagon and my interaction with men and women in uniform at all levels, from the most senior levels to enlisted all the way, did not demonstrate to me that there is a lockstep in being involved with any one particular party, particularly some of the newer and younger people who represent a more diverse workforce, not only in the military, but elsewhere. I will say this, Mark, that as I'm sure you know, the Military Times recently did a poll showing, I think for the first time ever, that troops, support Biden over Trump by 5 or 6 points. Here's what that means. It means that they don't like being used as political props. They don't like being sent on missions like that in Lafayette Square, which go against their values and what it is they're told to do. They don't like hearing that a president of the United States refuses to call on the carpet the leader of Russia when it is alleged with some considerable proof that Russia was responsible for bounty payments to Taliban contract work individuals to kill American troops. They certainly do not identify with and hugely reject throwing allies under the bus on the battlefield, as the president did with the Kurds when he removed the presence in Turkey. These are people who served on the battlefield against ISIS together with us and suffered great losses. And to have thrown them under the bus really made an impression. But I think calling troops suckers and losers, that's something that if you take a look at social media now, you are seeing veterans from the Korean War, from World War II, older veterans, younger men, women, universally going on in disbelief as well as in anger. The anger that we saw Joe Biden demonstrate last night is shared by many, many in uniform who have had sons and daughters serving on the battlefield. And it is one of the reasons that the recent letter that came out from national security leaders supporting Biden contained names of retired military that you never would have seen before on any such letter, including Paul Silva, the former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Trump.
Doug, do you still keep in touch with a lot of the people that you worked in the Pentagon with, people who might still be there in a career capacity? And I was taken by what Vice President Biden said on Tuesday in the debate, and basically said that the top general, when President Trump walked across Lafayette Park and tear gassed the protesters to get his photo up, was disappointed in that decision. I wonder if there's other rumbling coming out of the Pentagon or people that you know and are still in touch with that are similarly displeased by the performance of the president when it comes to that.
Displeased would be a true understatement.
Well, give me a more exact,
really nice way of putting it. I've already used my 1%. I've cashed that in already.
No, we're not censored by the FCC here. You can go nuts.
Friends of mine who serve at the Pentagon, and friends who both in political capacity and in military capacity, are hugely demoralized. They're afraid, and they're worried in particular about the competence of the current occupant of the White House to make decisions that is not going to get them and this country into military situations from which there's no easy out or escape. I think that view is pervasive, and I think that doesn't have to do with whether they're Republican or Democrat. These are patriots. These are men and women who have seen on the battlefield what you and I have probably never seen and never will, but they're also people who come from our communities from all over the country. And they're watching this and they're seeing this, and there's great concern at all levels. So yes, I do keep in touch. I have always, tipped my hat to all of them who have served their country, and especially now, because they're serving in positions in which many of them wish they didn't have to be. But they're doing so because their love of country and their concern for country outweighs a very considerable concern about this administration.
And we heard in Tuesday's debate, the president failed to disavow white supremacist groups. He sort of made veiled suggestions that his supporters should monitor polling places in a way that could be construed as illegal. How worried are you about the prospect for either paramilitary or militia group violence around the election, or if the president is still polling 10 points below Vice President Biden nationally 2 weeks before the election in a couple days, that there could be a kind of wag the dog situation? There could be a military skirmish that the president engages in order to try to rally around his reelection.
Well, I think there's 2 or 3 different points here. Let me tell you what I am not worried about. I am not worried that military leaders are going to follow orders to which they feel that, the difference between doing this and their oath to the Constitution requires them not to do that. What I do think is realistic is the hypothetical that the military might be called upon to play some role with regards to order in the streets. Orders that I don't believe military leaders will follow. I also don't believe the military will be part of, removing a president from office. I also believe that the institutions that are involved with a peaceful transfer of power, Congress, however broken it is, the courts, will play their roles. As disgusted as I am with members of the president's party in Congress refusing, to play any kind of role in refuting him or disowning him. The one thing that has heartened me somewhat is to have heard the comments, from everybody across the board that there will be a peaceful transition of power and that a new president will take office on January 20th. That having been said, I also think that there are people who are riled up enough in this country, and that riling up is in part due to the president's kind of dog whistles, as we saw last night, can do in the short term damage and cause fear. I think that will be addressed. My fear is that the messiness post-election is possible, not just with regards to ballot counting, but to protests in the street.
It is now time for a round of extraneous and miscellaneous questions for which we expect spontaneous and quick answers. Doug Wilson, what is the one book about America and the world that you would require both presidential candidates to read in the few weeks they have left of the campaign?
Probably David McCullough's Truman.
Okay. The worst American foreign policy blunder of the past century?
The election of 2016. It led to 4 years of the dismantling of some of the most important precepts of American foreign policy.
One piece of professional advice you wish you had received as a kid?
That the most important thing to consider when you're doing a job or taking a job is who you're going to be working with.
A role model for the work you do today?
Probably my mentor in the Foreign Service, my first boss, Lois Roth, now deceased, who was a public diplomacy official. Her recent post before I came in was Iran. She was somebody who taught me be inclusive and look to the next generation. I was the next generation then, and she was a mentor and a model.
How do you take that to heart when it comes to working with the next generation today?
It frames how I work. It's framed how I've worked for 35 years, looking to find really talented men and women who are in it for the right reasons. I'm much less interested in those who are using a job to just add to the resume, make sure they got the right resume, and as opposed to people who really want to do something and make a difference in what they're doing. And if I'm proud of anything in my career, it's that I've specialized in that.
What is one publication you read every day?
Well, it's easy to say the Washington Post, but I'm going to say something else. There's a publication called the Pakistan-Afghanistan Daily Update. It's written by a young man named Colin Cookman. He started this as a project at the Center for American Progress, and he got so into it that he ended up doing this on his own. And what it is a daily update making sense of a region that you have a hard time making sense of. Short, quick summaries of what's going on in the region. And it's how I've followed the Afghan peace process, the constant chaos in Pakistan, American policy there. And he's done the kind of thing that next generation leaders that I've been involved with should be doing, which is to take an initiative and turn it into something that is hugely useful for a lot of people.
And Doug, am I right that you essentially discovered Mayor Pete?
Well, I don't know about discovered, but I was his first boss. I picked him out of a sheaf of resumes I was given when I was running the John Kerry Edwards campaign in my home state of Arizona. And called him up and asked him if he'd be my research director. And 2 days later, he was on my doorstep.
Let's spend a minute on Mayor Pete's background, because he is a rising political talent, in part because of his strong foreign policy background and progressive views on use of force issues. And you advised him on all things national security. And one of the things that I thought was interesting about a speech he gave last summer, which I think was at Indiana University.
Yes.
He emphasized the importance of a more judicious and restrained approach to the use of military force, while also remaining actively engaged in the world through diplomacy and rejoining agreements like Paris Climate Agreement and Iran nuclear deal. And that essentially mirrors what the majority of Americans want. I'll cite our own surveys and our recent study at the Eurasia Group Foundation. Given the popularity of this approach, more military restraint and active diplomacy, why don't more politicians adopt it?
I actually think more politicians are adopting it. I think that even since the Vietnam War, I'd even go back that far, and going forward, with the possible exception of under George H.W. Bush, Operation Desert Storm. People understand increasingly that committing large numbers of land troops in places which are difficult, if not impossible, to bring under control under your way of life, has increasingly reduced domestic public support. That having been said, the use of military tools versus diplomatic tools is not a zero-sum choice. Pete, I think, wanted to make very clear, based in good part on his experience in Afghanistan, but also, as a pragmatist, that we don't have to say we're either always or never going to commit troops to a particular place.
The next president must set a high bar on the use of force, and an exceedingly high bar on doing so unilaterally. When America acts alone, it can only be because core interests are at stake and because there is no alternative. It is the difference between the necessary response to 9/11 in Afghanistan and the self-defeating invasion of Iraq. It is, in short, the difference between Normandy and Saigon.
He is somebody who definitely called for increasing use of diplomacy. And I have to say, Mark, that I think that that's almost become a trope. We have to use more diplomacy. We have to do better diplomacy. But I think Pete's approach on places like Afghanistan and Syria and Yemen are that we can't and shouldn't think of this as committing large troops in endless wars. We can and should think of this as where the United States, together with allies, can make a difference by having a small number of counterterrorist operatives, CIA operatives, intelligence operatives, to make sure that the basic rule of national security is met, which is essentially the security of the citizens of the United States and its partners. That can be done with fewer resources.
And haven't we lost sight of that to some extent? When did we go from wanting to protect Americans from physical harm or economic harm to thinking that entire governments needed to be overthrown in order to do that? Because I think that there is a way in which we might both inflate the threat of otherwise odious governments and deflate, obviously, the costs.
I think the roots are in Vietnam, but I also think that as a result of our victories in World War II and the fact that we became not only the predominant superpower, but almost the only superpower, despite the rivalry with the then Soviet Union, a feeling that nothing was impossible was, combined with we've got to take care of this problem, and we can take care of this problem if we throw enough money and muscle at it, started to grow. At the same time that started to grow, we also started to see longer wars, less successful efforts, a lack of understanding of the environments in which we were competing, and a disillusionment on behalf of the American public about why we were where. I think it's really important, Mark, to differentiate why we were where to a feeling of we should never go anywhere. I'll give you an example. I think Rwanda was an example of where then President Clinton thought that we could have acted in concert with our allies more strategically, more effectively, and made more of a difference than we did. And in the speech you refer to, the Indiana speech that Pete gave, he made clear that humanitarian reasons could be a valid reason for using military force in combination with all others as a last resort, as long as certain criteria were met. One of the things I think that he tried to make clear was that in Libya, when we went after Gaddafi and ended not only his regime and him, we had not given much, if any, thought to what comes the next day. What are the consequences? What are the unintended consequences? Which you have to think about not the day after, but many, many days and weeks before, and plan for those. There are many criteria, I think, that frame the use of force. Never using it is probably not a good idea, just like always using it is not a good idea.
I think that's wonderful because, again, we do these surveys, and I know that there was a generation of foreign policy makers that really began with Kissinger and who sort of disdained American public opinion to some extent, right? They weren't small d Democrats and thought that the whims or popularity of the whims of the American people or popularity of certain policies could cloud judgment, expert judgment. And I do think that, again, part of the reason we do these surveys is because we see the need to, in a democracy that's predicated on the consent of the governed, more engagement with public opinion. And I think also the American people are relatively enlightened on certain issues. Our survey found 70%, roughly, more than 70% support rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement. And so when President Trump last night said flatly that the American people don't support it, we threw up a quick fact check there because that's goes against the data that we have and we've seen. Same with the JCPOA. I think it registers around 67% support rejoining and the World Health Organization. So there is an enthusiasm for more diplomatic engagement. But although to your point, you mentioned, people can sometimes see increased diplomacy as a panacea or just a sort of a calling card rather than having a concrete plan to achieve it.
I think that's right. And it even extends to things like Trump's killing of Soleimani earlier this year. People are angry at Iran, but they're also skeptical could open the door to exactly the kind of ground troop, endless war scenario that they so severely reject. This president, shoots from the hip. His decisions are often often do not involve his own stakeholders in his government. Those responsible for diplomatic and military tools in his government. So I think if you go back, you'll find that there was great concern, and that the celebration of the assassination of a man who certainly had been a threat to the United States was not welcomed with open arms. It was a mixed reaction with the concern about what this would lead to by people who have family who have deployed in battlefields for years and years, leading the concern.
Yeah, and I want to get into the use of force and the AUMF. Your candidate, Pete Buttigieg, took a strong stance on repealing and placing the authorization for the use of military force from 2001, based in part on his own experiences in Afghanistan. And as many of our listeners know, that AUMF has been used to justify interventions now for nearly 20 years, including in the Sahel and in
Yes.
northern Africa and places that had nothing to do with 9/11. So you have experience working with this from your time in the Pentagon under Barack Obama. Can you explain just quickly to those listening what the AUMF is, and then how your experience at DoD affect your views for what we do in the next 4 years of a Trump administration or the first 4 years of a Biden administration in addressing the kind of outdated authorization of
AUMF means the authorization for the use of military force, which was initially authorized immediately after our involvement post 9/11 in Afghanistan. And Congress gave authorization for use of troops in Afghanistan. That has then served as a basis to authorize troops in, over a dozen countries around the world. What Pete was saying was Congress has a role. The administration has a duty to consult with Congress, and Congress has the duty to step up to the plate. And that there should be just like there should be no endless wars, there should be no open-ended, endless authorizations to fund them. And that what should be required are sunset provisions where administrations are required to go to renew authorization every 3 years if a conflict lasts that long, and that specific parameters be placed on the authorization and funding of use of force.
And that gets into the replace part of repeal and replace. A lot of people in my orbit are not fans of even replacing it. They think it just should be scrapped, right? The impetus, the reason for being of the AUMF is no longer there, and therefore it should be the president should seek approval from Congress to use military force overseas.
I think that's right.
Something you would go so far to agree with.
Again, we make a mistake if we look at this in zero-sum terms and say there never should be these or we always should use them. It should be required by circumstances, and understanding that the American people need to be invested in the decision or we're going to have no success in implementing it. Congress is the place to do it. So I guess Pete's call was twofold. A relook at the AUMF, making sure there are sunset provisions, but saying to members of Congress, you've been elected, and this is part of your duty. Speaking personally, not on behalf of Pete, but just speaking personally, taking a look at who's being elected to Congress over the past several years. I'll make an exception in that 2018, we had a number of men and women who'd served in uniform who are now serving in Congress who understand this. But too many are going to Congress based on, stepping stones to careers and not thinking enough about why it is they've been elected and what it is their responsibilities are.
So, Doug, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I am Mark Hanna, and this has been another episode of None of the Above, a podcast of the Eurasia Group Foundation. I want to give special thanks today to our None of the Above team, which make this all possible. Thanks to producer Caroline Gray, our editor Luke Taylor, sound engineer Zubin Hensler, and EGF's graduate research assistant Adam Pontius. If you enjoyed what you heard today, We'd appreciate you subscribing on Google Play, iTunes, Spotify, or anywhere else you find podcasts. Rate and review us, and if there's a topic you want us to cover or a guest you want us to invite on, shoot us an email at info@egfound.org. Thanks for joining. Stay safe out there, and see you next time.